So I'm going to talk about actually what I'm going to provide is a little bit of a background for a new tool. And instead of, I know in the abstract, what I provided was actually something about my own research. I actually kind of widened it out for this particular talk to see whether it may be of interest to people who are doing more categorizations and ontologies. So instead of it being truth under the microscope, we're just going to talk about under the macroscope, I should say. And first up, one of the things that kind of drew me to this research was the realization that sometimes when we talk about various concepts in philosophy, and for that matter, every other subject, it seems, we don't often look to think that the language that we employ at various time periods, actually is kind of a fossil record, if you will, of the society or the culture in which we find ourselves. And, have to ask ourselves, what were we thinking? And there are basically two, and hopefully a third now, if you will, ways of looking at it in terms of like historical psychology. And it's just our way of reasoning, perceiving, feeling, and acting are not necessarily universal and variable, but instead perhaps subject to modifications over time. This has led to what's called culturomics, which is a computational lexicography that studies human behavior through the quantitative analysis of digitized text. And then this macroscope is a means of studying how meanings change, in particular across time. And we already have a sense of this in philosophy in two ways. Well, there's close readings of texts, which would be aligned with, say, some human reading an original text, tending to individual words and sentences and making some form of an interpretation. Some examples here, there are so many, but I'll just point out Anthony Kenny's New History of Western Philosophy, and more importantly, I think who's doing a lot of great work in recent times, Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And this, I think, is a more ongoing matter. We can also do distant readings of historical texts, where we take a computational tool in which we use researchers use algorithms to extract meaning from billions of words of text. And we can look at them kind of at any given time period, synchronically or diachronically, in investigations which are across cultural time, kind of along the lines I think that Christoph was getting to in his fascinating work using the Philosophy of Science journal. There are other examples of distant reading of historical texts, which, just to name a few here: properties of word recognition, structure of memory, issues, individual differences in natural language production, changing frequencies of word usage across individual lifespans, changes of word use over hundreds of years, all of which are mostly focused in the linguistics area. But in philosophy, there's been one recently, I apologize for omitting a reference to it here, Brian Weatherson's work on looking at various philosophical concepts in philosophy journals. And I'm going to say whether there's a deficiency there shortly. And all right, so what is the macroscope? So this is a publicly available tool online at macroscope.tech, T-E-C-H, and it's a tool of quantitative historical analysis that permits researchers us to zoom in on any given year and to zoom out, say, over a longer period of time on words, and in particular their meanings and associations they maintained with historical language. We know that words provide some form of information about the past, and we can infer the meanings of words from the relations that they keep with other words. So the input that we provide on the macroscope is specific words or concepts of interest from the user, and the output is a range of historical indicators about changing semantics over time. If we want to drill down further, we can think of the macroscope as a user interface consisting of a client-server interaction. It's built in Node.js, handles user queries, analyzes them in real time using Python. The corpora that is currently implemented at the macroscope is the English Google Ngram book, 5 grams. And there are various analyses available, and I'm going to provide some examples here shortly. The classic example is that word frequencies. It does calculate word frequencies across time and in a given year. There are also co-occurrence matrices. Co-occurrence matrices enable us to, of course, compute word properties from the words that a given word co-occurs with. And interestingly, too, they also have, the macroscope also has sentiment, maybe called valence, positive or negative valence in any given year or across time, arousal and concreteness. Concreteness is actually might be of interest, especially for forms of ontologists, because concreteness has to do with the abstract versus kind of physical or more concrete change to a particular word. We're going to look at an example of that here shortly as well. Also, semantic drift. From my research in truth, this is a particularly important because I'm trying to undermine the fact that truth may have a relative, or truth is relative. And if there's less semantic drift across a semantic space, it seems to show empirically anyway that truth is not a relative concept. All right. So let's look at a few examples. First, say historical synonyms. First up, just to clarify something that is commonly used here, is diachronic word embeddings. So the macroscope uses distributional semantics to calculate which words are most semantically similar and to quantify the degrees of similarity. So it's not necessarily synonyms in a more, how should we say, formal sense. This is a synonym in a kind of, how should we say, programmable sense, if you will. And so the macroscope quantifies semantic similarities by computing the cosine distance of word embeddings for any pair of words. And words' historical meaning can be inferred by finding its most semantically similar words in a given time period. So two or more words notably can be compared and contrasted with one another in a given time period, or a single word may be compared with itself in different time periods. The example that is commonly used in the literature so far anyway on the macroscope has to do with depression and its relationship with, say, anxiety and fear. And what has been found is while psychologists typically disambiguate between these three, it looks like that what they find by doing a search on using the macroscope is that these typically are conflated. And the focus has largely been on one single time period. But if what I show here is that there's kind of an interesting occurrence which happens when you look for historical synonyms of depression across multiple years, across time. You should notice that in 2000, anxiety, psychosis, depressive hyperactivity disorder are more synonyms or with depression. And it's somewhat similar to the 1850 search, but in the 1950s, what's interesting is that it's more associated with the economic crisis that occurred, the global economic crisis that occurred in the 1930s between a recession, boom, crisis, et cetera. So it does seem that there's a shift in what the word use is as far as depression is concerned. Now, does the same sorts of thing happen with a philosophical concept? Well, I kind of threw something out there just to see how things would fly with, say, a priori. And there is some, I think, semantic shift, but not nearly as great, let's say, as what we saw with depression. There isn't kind of something that stands out as a means of shift here, let's say. So for better or worse, maybe a priori would be categorized within the same semantic space. On that note, let's take a look at some semantic drift. So the macroscope is able to track how semantics of individual words change over time. The words move along a path, if you will, in semantic space defined by the historical synonyms. A longer path would indicate that significant changes in a word's semantic meaning have occurred over a period of time, and a shorter path would suggest that there's been less significant changes in a word's semantic meaning over time. A good example here is the term gay. I'm going to show you a second one too, and I'll also speak to a few others as well. So gay in 1800, looking on the left side, that, if you will, of the graph here, stuck from 1800 to about 1950, and what would be considered like happy, amusement. It's certainly carefree, airy, all these sorts of things over on the left, but then has shifted, of course, to more recent occurrences in 2000 to be an identity of, say, one's sexual identity or even political movement in certain ways. Cell equally has shifted tremendously from on the right side being more of a prison or an enclosure, or some form of place, right, for a place, to more recently across 1900 to 2000 to be a term that is more readily employed in, say, the sciences. So for this, I should probably say a few more things about some other non-philosophical examples. Other examples to include might be something like broadcast. Broadcast in 1850 was more of an agricultural term. For example, when you're feeding chickens, it's broadcasting, but it's recently changed to, after especially 1950, to have to do with media, popular media, television, radio, etc. So it does have a large semantic drift. When you look at various philosophical concepts, one I've decided to do for today was object, to see if it moved in any significant manner. And it did, interestingly enough, between 1800 and 2000, starting with what looked to be more like chimeras, curiosities, kind of abstract, etc., to more physical objects. So when we use the term object, say now in 2000 and 2020, it has moved to a more physical or more concrete manner. Now, one of the things I didn't actually include in today's slides is the concreteness measure, which shows that there's been a dramatic shift between 1800 and 2000 for its movement, more abstract term, being object being a more abstract term to a more physical term, more concrete term. All right. On to synonym analysis, right? It's an accessible way to examine semantic structure of words based on the assumption that words are used in similar contexts and are also semantically related to each other. Right? So identifying the particular context in which a word has been used can help us understand how polysemous words are used in their different senses across varying contexts, furthering our understanding of the relationship between the semantic and co-occurrence of words. So, oops, sorry, I went backwards. So here is an example of nuclear in 2000. Just looking at a snapshot here, it looks to be that nuclear is most associated with weaponry, nuclear, perhaps war, missiles, etc. So more of a weapon understanding of nuclear. I'll move to metaphysics. Metaphysics is a philosophical example. Again, seems to be categorizing kind of nicely with other topics you might find in philosophy at the very, very general level. And then there's kind of this one outlier, Aristotle, if you will, so an individual, obviously, and then professor is also in there. What I had thought was going to be the case with metaphysics is that it would, because it's taking from the Google Enneagram database, that, or corpora, I should say, that I would see a lot more like occultism and mysticism and crystals and these sorts of things, but that's not the case. We can also look at the two clouds here in synonym analysis between 2000 and 1950. What's noticeable about nuclear is it's in 1950 was less associated with weaponry and more associated with science and scientific terminology, which would make sense because over the course of the last, that 50-year period, there was a great deal of discussion of during the Cold War of nuclear holocaust and worries about nuclear war. So that's a good reason why a good reason for thinking that such a word has changed in meaning. Metaphysics didn't have so much of a change per se, except for there seemed to be a drilling down of metaphysics into more specific terms, it looks like, between 1950 and 2000. Obviously, we see here Immanuel Kant and philosophy. And so there's still some general, but then there's more specific individuals being cited. All right. Finally, so we can also do a diachronic contextual structure of words. And this is basically, besides being able to quantify the contextual structure of words at a static point in time, you can also show quantify changes in the contextual structure of words diachronically. So despite the change, it's unclear whether the analyzed word would have lost its old meaning. This is one of the questions we actually have to have with a tool like this, is whether or not a word or topic may have changed in time, or just have to be more specific, perhaps, in its use. Again, the classic example here is gay between 1950 and 2000. There's a noticeable difference between, if you look on the top, any bar to the top right, going to the right, I think it's blue-ish, if you will, that indicates an increase in the contextual structure around the word gay. And anything in the red and moving to the left are those that have decreased. Again, it does track what we saw with the semantic drift graph earlier. This one I decided to do for today is a web. I decided to do web just to show that this seemed to have moved from a more concrete use in, say, terms of a spider or a web or whatnot, to a more abstract term, which we would use today in 2000, that 2020, obviously, but in 2000 it had moved to align with browser, server, internet, as opposed to being aligned with web or whatnot. So where does this leave us? Obviously, do concepts change over time? And in particular, do forms of a categorization change over time? I think I would say that it does, and perhaps it gets better, or perhaps we get more specific. And what about topics, areas of research that needs to be considered? So if we discover that a diachronic contextual structure of a philosophical term changes from, say, 1950 to 2000, then ought we study that change in that term and or at least account for it in its taxonomic position? I said that I was going to speak a little bit to Brian Weatherton's work, which is fantastic, on various philosophical concepts occurring in philosophy journals. But one of the concerns that we should have with it, and I've been kind of drilling through this material recently, especially with respect to truth, is that almost nothing of relevance to, say, what would say important for today's debates and the theory of nature of truth is actually published in a philosophy journal. It's published mostly in psychology journals. So we can't actually rule those out as a means to get familiar with that material, and need to account for that. And perhaps the Macroscope will be better enable us to do that, which is where I want to finish, which is basically the opportunities I foresee with using something like a Macroscope. And that is to build a certain corpora, not unlike what actually I think Christophe's already up to. So, and that is building corpora from philosophical and psychological resources in, say, JSTOR or PDCnet, and analyze it using the Macroscope, and look at specifically diachronic analysis of philosophical language from the mid-19th century today, for example, and look at the way in which philosophers have talked about ontology or existence or being, truth, etc., and how it's changed, and whether or not those changes would affect our categorization of ontological items. So does it affect our ontological taxonomy? So thanks, appreciate that.